Yeah, well, I suppose I should know a little bit more about journalism and the media, seeing as I've just come from the cold face of the Sunday Independent or whatever it is. I'm informed that it's actually a champagne and strawberries face rather than a cold face occasionally. And I suppose it's just a small little vignette that came into my head when I was leaving, is that myself and a colleague were writing an article which began, Eamon Gilmore and Michael Noonan are at war over the budget. I'm not going to tell you what they're at war over because you're going to have to wait until tomorrow. But I said to my colleague, right beside the desk is a style guide that says, do not use intemperate expressions like fury or at war or whatever. And I reminded him of him, and he said, well, what should we say? I said, well, we could try going to our news editor and saying they're having a philosophical discussion about the atrocities of the budget. And anyway, journalism being imperfect, we decided we'd stick with the war for the moment. And it might actually be reasonably accurate. I noticed Mr. Whelan mentioned that he prioritised, just to put us all in our place, he prioritised local coverage, and I was thinking to myself, well, you've got a fair bit of coverage, national coverage in the Sunday Independent over the last couple of years, much to the delight of your ministers such as Pat Rabbitte, who are always delighted to see John get a big run in the paper about the issues concerning Labour. One of the more interesting points I thought that was made was the notion or the belief that politicians hate the press. I think the relationship is more subtle. It is a relationship that I think is closer to that of a Victorian dad, by which I mean that politicians are the Victorian dad. They like authority, they like order, they like deference, and unfortunately, quite often, the scamps within the press do not provide them with that, which of course inevitably leads to tensions and I suppose to events such as the time that Environment Minister Phil Hogan told a colleague of mine, we'll put manners on ye knackers, which my colleague took as an insult, and I took more as a sort of Mr. Hogan's advanced position on the travelling community. That, you know, obviously this would not in any way be seen as being offensive. But it kind of brought my mind to another issue which I've often thought about in terms of Irish life, which is that one of the difficulties and one of the reasons why we are where we are today is that we emerged as a post-colonial society in 1922. And one of the great issues that the state had to face or should have faced was the issue of growing up, of leaving the adolescence that colonialism leaves you in. But as John Kelly famously said, we actually funked that. Our political class and those of us who voted for that class were happy to sort of just keep the machinery ticking over. We never left political or national adolescence. And I think that characterises a great deal of our discourse to this particular day, in the sense that there is always somebody else to blame. It is always Germany, it is always Europe, even though Germany and Europe are giving us money and trying to get us to reform ourselves. It's always politicians, it's always the press. And to a certain extent, that great sort of confrontation, partially perhaps because of the press sometimes, has not particularly taken place. And we should look at ourselves and think of ourselves almost in terms of, I often think that the Irish story and the relationship between politicians and the press is a little bit like the denouement to Lord of the Flies, where you have basically, groups of people, politicians on the one side, journalists on the other side, often quite well-meaning. But somehow there are flaws in their character or flaws in how we go about things that bring us to this sort of denouement where, in our case, we made a sacrifice of poor Brian Cowan, who became almost sort of the sacrificial creature who we invested all of our sort of flaws in and said, well, we'll kill him and we'll blame him, and that's it. And then the Germans arrived and looked at us and said, my God, what have they done on this particular island? Another feature, I think, of the relationship between politicians and the media is, and again it comes back to as a society growing up, as a society embracing things like openness and transparency and accountability, that one of the strangest things is how difficult it is for politicians to talk to journalists. And, it is almost kind of, politicians will say to me, or will say to journalists, well, if we talk to you now, we'll be misquoted. But the problem is that when they don't talk to us, when they view power as being, if I can borrow a phrase from Olivia O'Leary, where she once described Charlie McCreevy as in the Department of Finance as being a large farmer who would put his hands around a big plate of potatoes and was greedily eating them all. To a certain extent, the relationship between politicians and the media in terms of knowledge and in terms of, a sort of a grown-up or mature discourse is a little bit like that politicians acquire knowledge because of their position in power, put their arms greedily around it, don't tell the media anything, look at us and say, "Be God now, aren't we clever now not to be telling you what's going on?" And then wonder, in the absence, why they're being misconstrued the whole time, because there is an absence of discourse, and you get this sort of adolescent thing, which some might say politicians declaring war on each other might be tomorrow, might be accused of that, but I'll leave you be the judge of that. Should you buy the Sunday Independent? It's a complex relationship, and perhaps. Sometimes, and particularly in these times, I think that issues such as how politicians get on with journalists is a little bit like war in a foxhole in the First World War, when there's a far broader front going on. Joan Burton recently mentioned the issue of the difficulties posed by a Berlusconi-style media complex. I don't think she was just talking about ownership, because obviously ownership is an issue both in Italy and in Ireland, but in the nature of journalism, in where journalism prioritises, where Mr. Berlusconi's Italy, the news will be presented by bikini-wearing supermodels, which is not necessarily a bad thing, it must be said, but that's looking at it from my perspective. But that journalism becomes something that is short, is captured in 140 letters in Twitter, and the capacity to think or the capacity to argue leaves journalism. The point was made, for example, wouldn't it be great if we had investigative journalism? And that reminded me of the time that Mr. Adrian Hardiman, our Supreme Court judge, lacerated a group of humble court reporters for the sort of lack of complete coverage, to which the only thing that could be said to the good Supreme Court judge was, "Well, Gov, there ain't enough of us." You can't get investigative journalism unless there is money invested in that, where a newspaper or even radio station, television station, tell someone to go off for 2 months and come back with the full facts. That does not happen. Journalism increasingly nowadays is like the Chinese takeaway. You eat one, and then 3 hours later, you want another one, which is why I am the size that I am in that regard. As I say, it's a complex relationship. I'll perhaps leave you with two sort of examples of mediation, because I'm not a journalist who believes in excesses of confrontation. I'm sort of a conciliator in terms of how I do things. One confrontation I had with an individual, though, concerned that the Sunday Independent had turned against a political party after having been previously supportive. And I explained to them that it was actually quite simple. Politicians are used to living in a world sometimes where you experience defeat, losses. The politicians understand that not everything goes the way you want it to go. Editors, I explained, and I'm not talking about any current editors in the Sunday Independent or future editors for that matter, are psychopaths and are autocratic rulers who have no experience of democracy and expect that if you tell the government to declare war on Germany tomorrow, that they will do it, and become very distressed if you don't. The other experience I had was with, again, another politician who had, in terms of, had been favourably covered for us for a while, and then everything had run cold. And I tried to explain to them gently, perhaps an experience that some politicians might have had too in this room in the past, that the relationship between a newspaper and a politician can sometimes be a little bit like that farmer who adopts a lamb. And the lamb stays in the house, sleeps beside the aga, is bathed and petted and looked after. But there will come the day when Flossie is asleep beside the aga, and Flossie is plucked out. Flossie has her throat slit, and Flossie is inside the aga that she has been sleeping beside earlier. So the one message that I can say honestly to you, or as honestly as a journalist can do, is you can never trust us.